A black woman doctor boards her flight home after saving lives in the air for 14 hours straight. Exhausted but relieved, she finally settles into her first-class seat. But just as she's about to drift off, a flight attendant taps her shoulder. "Ma'am, I think you're in the wrong seat." She calmly shows her boarding pass. "First class. Seat 2A. Paid in full." The attendant's eyes narrow. "We'll need to verify this." 7 minutes later, after whispers, glances, and the quiet humiliation of standing in the aisle, the head flight attendant makes an announcement that changes everything. What happened next left the entire plane speechless. And set off a chain of events no one expected. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from and if you've ever faced a situation like this. And if this story moves you, don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more. It started as just another flight, but trust me, by the end, it was anything but ordinary. Lena Armstrong stepped into the terminal just as the afternoon sun dipped low behind the glass facade, stretching long shadows across the marble floor. The airport bustled with the kind of hurried energy only found in places that promised departure and reunion in equal measure. Yet, Lena moved at her own pace, steady, deliberate, carrying the weight of her uniform with a dignity earned over decades. She had flown this route countless times, New York to Atlanta, yet today she was not behind the controls. Her wings rested against her chest, golden stripes bright against the navy blue of her captain's jacket. But today, Lena was a passenger. As she walked toward her gate, she felt the familiar undercurrent of eyes brushing past her, some fleeting, others lingering a beat too long. A young boy tugged at his father's coat, pointing in Lena's direction. "Daddy, look, she's a pilot." The father smiled faintly, but Lena caught the flicker of hesitation. "That's right," the father answered, but his voice carried that subtle note. The unspoken qualifier beneath his words. Lena knelt slightly, meeting the boy's wide eyes. "One day, you could be a pilot too," she said softly, adjusting the small wings pinned to her lapel. The boy grinned, but his father's eyes stayed on Lena, as if weighing the sincerity of her words. She straightened, feeling the weight of that look as she moved on. The gate. At the gate, Lena presented her boarding pass to the young agent behind the counter. She was calm but watchful, the way one learns to be after years of navigating the delicate balance between authority and suspicion. "First class?" The agent's eyes scanned the ticket, then shifted to Lena's face. "That's right," Lena replied, keeping her tone light. The agent hesitated. His fingers hovered over the scanner longer than necessary. "Just one moment," he said, stepping away without meeting her gaze. Lena shifted her carry-on to her other hand, settling into the silence that followed. Around her, the flow of travelers continued uninterrupted, businessmen typing furiously, families juggling strollers and suitcases. Yet, she felt as though she stood apart from the current, an island in the stream. When the agent returned, his smile was tight, practiced. "All set, Captain Armstrong." Lena took her boarding pass without a word and made her way down the jet bridge. Boarding. In first class, the seats were half filled with passengers who wore their privilege with ease. A silver-haired man in a tailored suit reclined with a whiskey in hand, eyes narrowing slightly as Lena approached. "Excuse me," she said, gesturing toward her assigned seat by the window. The man glanced at the empty seat, then at Lena. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" His tone was light, but Lena caught the sharp edge beneath it. She didn't flinch. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." He grunted but said nothing more as Lena slid into her seat, her posture unwavering. The flight attendant appeared shortly after, her professional smile fixed in place. "Would you like something to drink?" "Ma'am? Just water, thank you." The man beside her ordered another whiskey, but his gaze lingered as the attendant walked away. "You military?" he asked. "No," Lena replied. "Family in the airline business?" Lena turned to him, meeting his eyes directly. "I've been flying commercials for 23 years. This is my airline." The man blinked, caught momentarily off guard by the quiet authority in her voice. "I see," he muttered, focusing on his glass. But Lena could tell he didn't, not really. The whisper, as the plane taxied down the runway, Lena gazed out the window, watching the tarmac blur beneath them. She had flown larger planes than this one, Boeings that carried hundreds across oceans. But at this moment, she felt smaller somehow. It wasn't the first time she had been questioned, nor would it be the last. The engines roared, and the plane lifted into the air. Yet even as the ground fell away, Lena knew that some weights couldn't be left behind. At 30,000 feet, the Earth looked small and distant. But prejudice had a way of climbing, finding its seat beside you. Uninvited yet persistent, Lena settled back in her chair, hands resting lightly on the armrests. She had learned long ago that belonging wasn't granted. It was claimed, sometimes silently, sometimes loudly. But always earned in moments like this. Moments when the world whispered, "Are you sure?" And she answered, "Yes, I'm sure." Lena Armstrong had learned long ago that silence was rarely empty. It had weight, shape, and a texture that stretched between people. Sometimes soft like cotton, other times brittle like glass. Tonight, at 36,000 feet, it felt like steel. The hum of the engines filled the cabin. But Lena could feel the man beside her searching for the right words. Words that could explain away the assumptions he had made without acknowledging them outright. He shifted in his seat, cleared his throat, and cast a sideways glance in her direction. "You must have some stories," he said finally, swirling the ice in his glass. Lena turned her head slightly, her eyes still on the thin band of sunset fading beyond the window. "I suppose I do," she replied, careful to leave the invitation unopened. But the man pressed on, as they always did. "I mean, being a pilot," he continued, "you must see some interesting things up here. Ever have to deal with difficult passengers?" Lena smiled faintly, though not for the reasons he might have thought. "Difficult passengers come in many forms," she said, letting the words sit between them. The man chuckled nervously, but Lena knew he had heard her. Cabin pressure. The flight attendant returned with their meals, a delicate arrangement of steak and vegetables plated in neat rows. The man thanked her, but Lena caught the way his eyes lingered on the attendant's retreating figure. "She's new," he said, as if explaining something. "Doesn't seem used to seeing folks like you up here." "Folks like me?" Lena arched her brow, though her voice remained calm. The man hesitated. "I mean, you know, women pilots. You don't see many. Not many of us." "No," Lena said softly, placing her fork neatly beside her plate. "But enough." She left the words there, light but deliberate, like placing glass on a table. He shifted again, clearly unsettled, but Lena knew better than to offer him comfort. This wasn't about easing his discomfort. The attendant passed again, pausing to check on their drinks. She glanced at Lena but didn't ask if she needed anything more. Lena could see it. The subtle hesitation in her eyes. The same silent question behind the practiced smile. Is she really supposed to be here? This was not new. It was as old as the sky itself. Descent. Later, as the lights dimmed and passengers reclined into the soft hush of evening, Lena opened the novel tucked into her lap. The pages turned easily beneath her fingers. But her mind stayed rooted in the present. She had almost grown used to this. The quiet tug of war between presence and doubt. Between proving and existing. From the corner of her eye, she noticed Sarah. The young flight attendant lingering near the front of the cabin, whispering to another crew member. Lena caught the glance that flicked her way. Subtle but unmistakable. Lena wasn't surprised when Sarah approached moments later, smoothing her uniform as she bent slightly toward Lena's seat. "Excuse me, Captain Armstrong," she began, her voice soft but rehearsed. "I just wanted to say, I apologize for earlier. I didn't realize that I belonged here," Lena finished, though her tone was kind. Sarah's face is colored. "Yes, ma'am, I didn't mean." "I know," Lena said gently, setting her book aside, "but I want you to remember something." Sarah straightened slightly, her eyes wide with attention. "Every person on this plane has earned their seat, Sarah, whether they're flying it or riding in it." Lena's eyes held hers for a long moment. "And it's not your job to question how they got here." Sarah nodded quickly, her embarrassment clear but softened by understanding. "Yes, Captain, I won't forget." As Sarah stepped away, the man beside Lena exhaled, shaking his head. I guess you get tired of that, he said. Lena's gaze returned to the window, watching the last of the light disappear beneath the clouds. Only when I let it. The weight of unspoken things had a way of thickening the air. Lena had learned. It could stretch across a room, coil in the corners of a conversation, or sit between two passengers in the narrow aisle of first class. Tonight, it stretched between her and the man in 3B like an invisible partition. Outside the window, the night folded over the wing, swallowing the last threads of daylight. The city lights below flickered like distant stars, cold and far enough away to forget. Lena shifted in her seat, crossing one leg over the other. She could feel him watching her again, though he pretended not to. You fly often? He asked finally, as if they hadn't already crossed this bridge. Lena turned a page in her book without answering. She didn't owe him conversation, but she had long since accepted that silence was rarely left alone. I'm just saying, he pressed, voice dipping lower. It's rare, you being a captain. I haven't seen that before. Lena glanced up, her eyes steady on his face. You don't see a lot of things, she said evenly. The man blinked, caught off guard. It's not personal, she added, softening the edge just enough to keep the conversation from cutting too deep. Most people don't, but just because you haven't seen something doesn't mean it isn't there. The man nodded slowly, but his eyes betrayed him, still searching for the piece that didn't fit. Turbulence. Halfway through the flight, the seatbelt sign chimed in with the subtle weight of authority. The captain's voice drifted through the cabin, smooth but firm. Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting some turbulence ahead. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. Lena smiled to herself. She knew that tone, the calm, practiced cadence pilots used when the air turned unpredictable. She had spoken those very words countless times. The plane dipped slightly, and Lena felt the shift ripple through the cabin. Passengers who had been dozing stirred. Drinks trembled in half-filled glasses. Sarah, the young flight attendant, moved with care as she secured loose trays. She paused by Lena's seat, hesitating just long enough to betray her lingering discomfort. Captain Armstrong, she said quietly, glancing at the overhead bin. Is this normal, the turbulence? Lena closed her book. Yes, she replied with a knowing smile. Completely normal. Sarah exhaled in relief. Lena held her gaze a moment longer. Remember that, she added softly, even when things feel unsteady, it doesn't mean they're out of control. Sarah nodded and moved on. But Lena knew the lesson wasn't about turbulence. The man beside her cleared his throat. You handle things differently, he said, watching Sarah disappear down the aisle. Lena's eyes flicked to him. Differently how? He shrugged. I don't know. I guess I expected more. He trailed off, fumbling for the right word. Fireworks? Lena offered. Maybe. Lena chuckled under her breath. No need, she said. The air up here doesn't ask for noise. It asks for control. The plane trembled again, but Lena barely noticed. Altitude. Later, when the turbulence had passed and the cabin settled into its steady rhythm. The man in 3B leaned closer, lowering his voice. Can I ask you something? Lena met his gaze, tired but open. You can. He hesitated, as if the question weighed something. Does it ever get to you? He asked. Being questioned like that? Having to prove yourself over and over? Lena studied him for a long moment. Yes, she answered honestly, but I don't let it stay. He frowned. How? Lena's eyes drifted toward the window, where the clouds stretched endlessly below them. Because the sky doesn't care, she said. It holds everyone the same. For the first time that evening, the man fell silent, and Lena let it stay that way. The thing about silence, Lena thought, was that it rarely stayed empty. It invited echoes sometimes of things you thought you'd left behind. She leaned her head against the window, the cold glass pressing back against her temple. The hum of the engines stretched out like a lullaby, steady and constant. But constancy, she knew, was an illusion. A few rows ahead, she noticed the shift before it fully unfolded. A man standing in the aisle, speaking in hushed but forceful tones to a flight attendant. The tension clung to the space between them like static before a storm. Lena had seen this scene before. She could read the shape of it in their body language. In the stiffness of the woman's shoulders and the way the man gestured, wide. Deliberate. His voice, though low, had that unmistakable sharpness. I just think I'd feel more comfortable if someone else sat there. Even from a few seats away. The words cut clean across the cabin. The woman he referred to, an older black woman in the middle row, shifted slightly but kept her eyes fixed on her lap. Lena's breath caught in her chest. It wasn't loud. These things rarely were. That was the trick of it. The way prejudice disguised itself in politeness. Veiled under the language of comfort. Convenience. The flight attendant, clearly caught between duty and discomfort, plastered on the thinnest of smiles. I'm sorry, sir. That's her assigned seat. The man exhaled sharply through his nose. I understand that, he said, his voice still carefully modulated. But surely there's space somewhere else. Lena's fingers tightened around the armrest. Wait. She felt it then. The familiar, suffocating weight of expectation, not from the man in the aisle, but from the space around him. Other passengers averted their eyes, pretending to be absorbed in their magazines, their screens, their drinks. Even the ones who disagreed with him wouldn't speak. Not yet. Lena recognized the moment. It was the space between confrontation and compliance, where silence could tip the scales in either direction. She glanced toward the woman in the middle row. Her hands trembled faintly against the hardcover book resting in her lap. But she said nothing. Lena's heart sank. She knew that silence too. It was the silence of someone who had measured the risk and chosen the path of least resistance. The silence of someone who had carried this weight for too long. Altitude. The plane climbed steadily through the night. But Lena's pulse quickened. She could stay out of it. She wasn't involved. It wasn't her seat, her fight, her humiliation. But wasn't it? The man shifted, preparing to press the issue further. Lena unbuckled her seatbelt. Excuse me. Her voice, soft but deliberate, sliced through the stale air. Both the man and the flight attendant turned. Lena held his gaze. I believe she's comfortable where she is, Lena said plainly, nodding toward the woman. The man blinked, thrown off balance by the intrusion. I wasn't talking to you, he replied, his tone clipped. Lena smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. No, she said, but you were talking about her. The aisle between them stretched longer than it should have, heavy with things unsaid. Other passengers began to glance up now, their faint indifference cracking under the weight of attention. The flight attendant, sensing the shift, took a cautious step back. Lena didn't move. The man's jaw tightened, his pride flickered behind his eyes, wrestling with the awareness that any further protest would make him the center of unwanted attention. After a pause, he exhaled. Forget it, he muttered, returning to his seat. Landing. The tension didn't fully dissipate, but the weight shifted just enough for the cabin to breathe again. The woman in the middle row lifted her eyes for the first time. Catching Lena's gaze, a silent acknowledgement passed between them, brief but solid. Thank you. Lena dipped her head in return, fastening her seatbelt once more. As the plane continued toward its destination, Lena turned toward the window. The city lights flickered below, but she didn't need to see them. She already knew they were there, constant, unshaken, and waiting. Lena believed that some moments did not simply pass. They lingered, haunting the spaces between words, curling like smoke in the corners of otherwise ordinary days. It had been 2 weeks since the flight. She hadn't spoken much about it. Not to friends, not even to David. He'd asked. Of course. He always did when he sensed something brooding behind her silence. But Lena brushed it off, assuring him it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. That encounter had burrowed beneath her skin. Not because it was rare, but because it wasn't. It was the kind of thing that nestled quietly in memory, tugging at the edges when she least expected it, like now. As she stood waiting in line at the post office. The line. Lena shifted her weight from one foot to the other, absently watching the slow shuffle of bodies ahead of her. The line crept forward at a pace that seemed to mock her impatience. Behind the counter, a young black woman assisted customers. Her movements fluid, efficient. Lena admired her ease, the way she held herself. How she kept her composure even as the man in front of her grew increasingly agitated. I just don't see why it's taking so long. He grumbled, loud enough for half the post office to hear. His words tumbled out heavy with irritation, laced with something else Lena recognized instantly, dismissal. She glanced up, noting the way the young woman's shoulders squared. How her smile remained, but her eyes cooled ever so slightly. I appreciate your patience, the woman said, sliding his package across the counter with practiced calm. But Lena saw the shift. She felt it like an aftershock. Subtle but sharp. Recognition. When it was Lena's turn, she stepped forward, meeting the woman's gaze directly. Thank you, Lena said softly, passing over her envelope. The woman looked at her curiously, the briefest flicker of recognition dancing behind her eyes. For what? Lena smiled. For not letting it ruin your day. The woman's lips curved faintly at the edges. Oh, I let it ruin part of it, she replied with a quiet laugh. Just not enough to stop me from cashing my check. They both chuckled at that. But there was something unsaid between them. An unspoken acknowledgement of the weight they carried. Patterns. As Lena stepped out onto the sidewalk, the sun hit her full in the face, warming her skin but not quite reaching the cold knot in her stomach. It wasn't just that man. It was the accumulation of moments like that. The dozens of small dismissals. The questions about competence. The expectation that composure must be maintained at all times. She thought again of the woman on the plane. Of the moment Lena had stood up. It had felt victorious then. But now she wondered. Would the man remember it at all? Would he reflect? Or had it already been folded into the crease of his ordinary day? It was exhausting. This constant negotiation, deciding when to speak and when to let silence settle like dust. The test. Later that afternoon, Lena stopped by a cafe, drawn in by the promise of coffee and a few quiet moments. The small bell above the door jingled softly as she stepped inside. The cafe was warm, intimate. A few tables were scattered near the windows. And behind the counter, a teenage barista greeted her with a distracted nod. Lena placed her order and took a seat near the back, letting the sounds of the cafe wash over her. She barely noticed the commotion at first, a couple of raised voices near the register. But as she glanced up, she saw it unfolding once more. A black man in line, holding his phone, speaking calmly as the barista frowned. I'm telling you, it went through. I can show you the confirmation. The barista's voice dropped, but Lena still caught the sharpness in her tone. I just need to verify it. Sir. Lena's heart tightened. It was happening again. Different setting. Same scene. She could look away. No one would fault her for staying silent. But her pulse quickened. She remembered the post office. The flight. The woman in the middle row. And suddenly, she was on her feet. Choice. Excuse me, Lena said, stepping toward the counter. Her voice was light, casual, but deliberate. The barista turned, startled. I think there's a glitch with the card reader, Lena said, pulling out her phone. Mine had the same issue last week. The man glanced at her, his expression unreadable. The barista hesitated, caught between policies and perception. It's not usually a problem. But I can try again. She ran the card once more. Approved. Lena saw the flicker of embarrassment in the barista's eyes. Though no apology followed, the man gave Lena a small nod of thanks before stepping away. Taking his coffee to a table near the window, Lena returned to her seat, hands trembling slightly as she wrapped them around her cup. Aftermath. The man lingered for a few minutes longer, then approached her table. Appreciate that, he said simply. Lena looked up, offering a small smile. Anytime. He studied her for a moment. It's not about the card. You know. I know. Their eyes met, and in that exchange, Lena felt something settle. It wasn't enough to change the world. But maybe, she thought, it was enough to shift the weight just a little for herself and for someone else. And sometimes, that was how change began. The air in Lena's apartment felt heavier that evening. The kind of weight that didn't settle from exhaustion alone but from the quiet reckoning of a long overdue confrontation. She hadn't expected to carry the cafe incident home with her. But it clung stubbornly, weaving itself into the fabric of her night. The way she washed the dishes slower than usual. The way she left the television muted. letting the hum of the city outside fill the silence. The phone call. Her phone buzzed around 8 p.m. David's name flashed across the screen. She considered ignoring it, but old habits and familiar comforts won. "Hey," she answered, pressing the phone to her ear as she leaned against the kitchen counter. "Long day?" David's voice, warm and steady, felt like a tether. "You could say that." There was a pause. She heard the faint shuffle of him settling into his chair on the other end. "You're thinking about something," he said. It wasn't a question. Lenas smiled faintly. "I saw it happen again today." David exhaled sharply, the kind of sigh that carried years of shared frustration. "Where?" "Cafe on 8th. Card declined. And the barista wasn't having it. He had to prove himself." Same old dance. David's silence stretched for a beat too long. "I didn't stay quiet," she added softly, almost like an apology. "Recognition." David chuckled dryly. "I didn't think you would." "You never do." But Lena could hear the edge behind his amusement, the quiet fear that existed between them. They both knew these weren't just moments. They were tests. And every test came with its risks. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," Lena replied, though even she didn't believe it. "Yeah," David said. "That's what you told me last time too." Memory. Lena let the memory surface. The summer before, when she'd been in line at the grocery store and overheard the clerk question a black teenager about the authenticity of his $100 bill. It had been crisp, fresh from his wallet, but the clerk held it under the light a second too long. She'd stepped in then too. And after the boy left, she'd noticed how the clerk's eyes lingered on her as she paid for her groceries. A few days later, Lena found a ticket on her windshield. The car had been parked legally. Small wars, David had called them. "It's exhausting," Lena admitted, sinking into her couch. "Yeah," David said quietly, "but we don't get to sit out." "Not really." The layers. Lena set the phone on speaker, letting David's voice drift through the room as she flipped through mail she had no intention of opening. "It's not the big things that get me," she said after a while. "It's not the protests, the news headlines. It's moments like today, the tiny cracks that no one else seems to notice." David's voice softened. "You know why that is, don't you?" Lena waited. "It's because the small cracks are the ones you've lived with the longest," he said. "They're familiar. They know your name." Lena didn't respond. At the crosswalk. The next morning, Lena crossed the street near her office, the sun casting long shadows as she waited at the light. Beside her, a white man in his early 40s stepped to the curb, glancing at her for just a second too long. Lena felt it immediately. It wasn't overt, not the kind of stare that led to confrontation. But it was enough. A silent calculation. "Who are you? Why are you here?" The light turned green. Lena walked on, leaving the weight of his gaze behind her. The building. Inside the office building, Lena rode the elevator with 3 other people, none of whom spoke. The doors opened on the 6th floor, and she stepped out, greeted by the sterile hum of fluorescent lights and the low murmur of voices from cubicles down the hall. By mid-afternoon, Lena was deep in paperwork when David texted her. "Lunch tomorrow? There's something I want to show you." She replied quickly. "Sure." Tomorrow's quiet battle. The next day, Lena met David at a small diner downtown. Tucked into the corner booth they favored, David set down his phone and pushed a small, folded newspaper toward her. She unfolded it, scanning the headline. It was about a local initiative, Black-owned businesses partnering with schools to offer mentorship programs. "Small victories," David said, watching her reaction. Lena smiled, though the weight from the day before hadn't entirely left her. "Small cracks," she replied. David nodded, as if to say, "Yes. But even cracks can let light in." Lena sat in her car outside the community center, watching the slow stream of parents and children filtering through the glass doors. The streetlights overhead hummed against the early evening sky, shadows stretching long across the pavement. She could see David's silhouette inside, moving with ease between the folding tables and chairs, his voice rising in warm laughter. It was the kind of scene that felt familiar, ordinary even. But Lena knew better. She could see the tension beneath David's smile, the way his shoulders sat just a little too high, like someone holding the weight of too many unspoken words. The children. When she finally stepped inside, the children were the first to notice her. A girl with dark braids tugged at David's sleeve. Is that your friend, Mr. David? David glanced up and smiled. Yeah, that's Lena. The girl waved shyly, and Lena offered a small wave back. She runs her own office downtown, David said, his voice light but pointed. She's in charge of a lot of people. The girl's eyes widened. She must be important. Lena's smile faltered for just a moment, but she caught herself. Sometimes, Lena replied, but I think Mr. David is more important today. The talk. Later, as the event wound down, Lena found David standing near the back exit, leaning against the frame like he was trying to disappear into the wall. Good turnout, she said, watching the last of the families gather their things. David nodded, his eyes still on the children laughing in the corner. They're too young to know what's coming, he said quietly. Lena followed his gaze. The children were bright-eyed, their faces lit with the ease of being in a space that felt safe. They'll learn soon enough, she replied. David glanced at her sharply. Yeah, that's what I'm afraid of. Recognition. It wasn't the first time they'd had this conversation. David often joked that Lena was too quick to accept the inevitable, that she carried too much weariness for someone still in her 30s. But David knew that she hadn't earned that weariness alone. She wore it the way her father had worn his, a silent inheritance passed down through glances in rearview mirrors and polite, measured tones in the presence of authority. Do you remember when we were their age? David asked. Lena nodded. We thought we could outrun it, she said. David laughed. But it was hollow. Yeah, we really did. The waiting room. Lena thought about the first time she had understood the weight of her skin. She'd been 12, sitting in the waiting room at the dentist's office with her father. They'd arrived early, but people who came in after them were called first. Her father never said anything about it, but Lena saw the way his hand rested lightly on his knee, fingers tapping in a slow, steady rhythm. When they were finally called, the receptionist's apology was brief, barely a flicker of recognition. Later, her father had bought her ice cream, though neither of them mentioned why. Invisible threads. It's not that they don't see us, Lena said, her voice distant. It's that they see us exactly as they want to. David didn't respond right away. I used to think if I worked harder, if I was just better, it would change. He finally said. Lena turned to face him. Did it? David met her eyes and shook his head. Not in the ways that matter. The mask. There was a phrase Lena's grandmother used to say, something about the cost of the mask. Wear it long enough, and you'll forget where your skin begins and where the mask ends. Lena used to think she understood it. But now, standing next to David, she wondered how much of her life had been shaped by wearing that mask, by the quiet negotiations that happened every day. The polite smiles, the carefully measured responses, all the small ways she had learned to navigate spaces not meant for her. Departure. As they left the community center, David walked her to her car, pausing with his hands shoved deep in his pockets. You know, it's exhausting, he said, his voice low, carrying it all the time. Lena unlocked her car and leaned against the door. Yeah, she agreed. But what's the alternative? David shrugged. We let it go for a while, he said, just for tonight. Lena considered that, and for the first time in a long while, she let herself believe it was possible. Lena sat in her office long after the last light in the hallway had gone dark. The city outside her window pulsed with life. The distant hum of car horns, the flicker of billboards. Yet inside, the silence pressed down like the weight of an old coat she'd forgotten she was wearing. She stared at the document glowing on her screen. The email was concise, formal, and polite. We appreciate your concerns. However, after careful review, we've determined there was no evidence of misconduct. Lena didn't need to read it again. She already knew the script by heart. The conference room. 2 days earlier, she had sat across from the board. A long table separated them. Not physically, but in every way that mattered. They nodded at all the right moments, scribbled notes in their leather-bound planners. But their eyes glazed over when she spoke about the subtle shifts in tone during meetings. The interruptions, the ways her suggestions were overlooked until echoed by someone else. It's not that simple, One of the men had said. It never is, Lena had replied. David's call. The phone buzzed next to her elbow, pulling her out of the spiral. Are you still at work? David's voice was light, but Lena caught the thread of concern beneath it. Just finishing up. You get the email? Lena's eyes drifted back to the screen. Yeah. There was a long pause on the other end. I told you not to get your hopes up, David finally said. Lena exhaled, not in frustration, but in recognition. You think I don't know that by now? I know. David's voice trailed off. I didn't want you to have to feel it again. The meeting. She remembered the first time she had spoken up in one of those rooms. Fresh out of graduate school, armed with research and ambition. Her voice had wavered slightly, but her points were solid. When the meeting ended, an older colleague had pulled her aside. His smile tight. You handled yourself well there, he said, but maybe next time, ease up a little, don't come on so strong. Lena remembered the heat that burned behind her ears. She hadn't come on strong. She'd simply spoken. But in that room, in that context, her voice had been too much. The long way home. David's voice broke through her thoughts again. Are you driving home soon? Yeah, in a minute. You know, you don't have to win every battle. Lena. She leaned back in her chair, gazing out at the skyline. I know, but I also know that if I don't speak, no one else will. David sighed, but there was no argument. He understood too well. The elevator. Lena finally shut down her computer and grabbed her coat. The office felt hollow as she walked toward the elevator. Inside, she caught her reflection in the polished walls, posture straight, expression unreadable. She knew this image. It was the same one she wore in every boardroom, every meeting, every casual conversation where she measured her words against the room's temperature. The mask. Wear it long enough, and you'll forget it's there. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her head. At the intersection, the city lights blurred as Lena drove, the stoplights flashing red against her windshield. At an intersection, she spotted a young boy on the corner with his mother. He pointed at the sky, eyes wide with wonder as a plane arched overhead. Lena smiled. She remembered being that child, pressing her forehead against the glass, watching airplanes disappear into the clouds. Back then, the world had felt limitless, vast and full of possibility. The light turned green, but Lena lingered for a moment longer. The mask was heavy, yes, but so was silence. And some silences, she knew, could last for generations. As she drove forward, Lena thought not of the email still waiting in her inbox, but of the next meeting, the next room, the next time she would sit at that table. Her voice would not waver. Not because she expected them to listen, but because she had learned that even the smallest ripple could disturb the surface.